and the other are breastfeeding prayers. I want to encourage you in how to do that better. And I'm sharing you also because of a distressing incident that I was part of recently. That's a little bit of background. But before we get to really start, I want to tell you about some history which we are still part of. One bit is a really long time ago. For example, on Friday was the 220th anniversary of the foundation of the Church Missionaries Society, which we're still supporting people from now. That's a little bit of trivia, but one of many missionary societies that were established at the end of the 18th century after that massive revival where Whitfield and Wesley and others. But I wanted to bring you back into the present, more or less the present. It depends how old you are, of course. But in the 1950s and 1960s in Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, amongst other places, there was a major movement of God where lots of people were converted. And in Australia, there was a huge influence in Sydney and Melbourne, and probably less in the other states, I think. I want to tell you a little bit about Sydney because that's where I grew up, that's what I've observed. This is little snippets of history, there are lots of other examples of it. Now, you'll know, of course, that it was Billy Graham who was the reaper. He reaped a huge harvest. And in Sydney, it made a huge impact, particularly in the Anglican Church, but the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church at the time also. And he was reaping, primarily he wasn't sowing. And one of the reasons there was a huge harvest, at least in Sydney and probably Melbourne, is that prior to that, a lot of other work had gone on. For example, in 1934, the Anglicans in Sydney got a new archbishop, who was a missionary bishop, had been the Bishop of Sichuan in China, an Englishman. And he came to be the Bishop of Sydney. He was there right until the year before Billy Graham came. He made sure that Billy Graham got invited. He died just before it happened. He established a whole new ethos of evangelism. He changed the theological education. There were preachers starting to preach the Bible much more thoroughly, and there were, both in the Methodist Church and the Anglican Church, there were very gifted evangelists who were already doing the work of an evangelist all around. It had an impact in Scripture Union, for example. And after Billy Graham, lots and lots of impacts were made, not only in Scripture Union, but certainly amongst Anglicans and Baptists. So the present Anglican Diocese of Sydney is really still showing the fruit of converts who were converted back in 1959 and in the 60s. A huge amount of evangelism and enthusiasm for evangelism went on for a number of decades and is still rolling on in different forms already. When Billy Graham came in New South Wales, I'll tell you Anglican history, those who are not Anglicans, I hope you'll be really interested in this. In New South Wales in the 50s, there was one evangelical diocese. At the moment, there are 4, because the gospel has spread through New South Wales as a result of people who were converted through that reaping of the Billy Graham movement. Huge change. Now, in Perth, the story was a little bit different, but again, this is a little snippet of Anglican history. So back in the post-war years, through up into the 50s, there was a significant ministry amongst some Anglican young people through an organisation of the Church Missionary Society called the League of Youth. It was a youth organisation. Lots of people were nurtured and taught and evangelised, and some of them were called into the ministry. They went across to the east, to Ridley College and other places, came back as ordained people, and they established very strong foundations in Perth amongst the Anglicans. Now, other good things were happening with Baptists and others back in those days. What happened after they really started to establish, particularly in Highgate and other places, Brian Hall, Ken Drayton were some of the early pioneers of this. From the 1970s onwards, at least in Perth, the number of the evangelism that came through Anglican parishes has grown terrifically. So when we came here, there were probably a few evangelical Anglican parishes. Now there's probably at least a dozen. And they've grown by evangelism. There was a huge amount of evangelism going on in the 70s and 80s at least. And it's still going on. We're still part of that. This little bit of history, that's a little snippet, isn't it? There's a lot more that could be said. It's impacted Scripture Union, it's impacted all sorts of things. And it's not only Anglicans, I'm just telling a little bit of the story. Trinity Theological College is a fruit of all of that. So we're still in the effect range of something that God was doing, he's been doing for a long time. A big reaping in the 50s, but foundations before that, both here and elsewhere. And it's still going on. God is still doing stuff. That's sort of setting the scene so that you can remember that God is at work and he's been doing really important things, and in Perth, significant things, particularly amongst the Anglicans, but not only there. There's other histories could be told of other churches. Now, background to this sermon is not only the sermons that John has been preaching, as I've been thinking, but part of it is what I would call nursing home prayers. The Lord showed me my nursing home prayers. I didn't call them this, but that's what they were when I was in Darwin. I was ministering in Darwin in the 80s, I think it was. Now, a nursing home prayer goes something like this. Lord, I cannot do this. I need you. I'm weak. I'm a weak vessel. I don't know how to do it. I'm helpless. I'm da-da-da-da. You know how it goes? Lots of you pray this prayer. It's the nursing home prayer. It presses the divine button, and God comes as the carer and fixes you up, cleans up your vomit or whatever it is. Okay. Now, a nursing home prayer is a half prayer, and it's okay as long as you get the other half as well. We'll come back to that. The other thing has to do with breast beating prayers. I'm going to talk about this in a moment. But lots of us want to beat our breasts about all sorts of bad things that we know about. The other thing is a distressing incident. This is background to what I'm about to start to talk about. We had a talent quest here a few weeks ago. Some of you went to it. And there were lots of non-church people there. And I assume that many of them were unbelievers. But there are almost no missionaries there. There were potential ministries there because there were lots of converted people there. Now, this has nothing to do with the organisers of that talent quest, nothing to do with the people who did it. What I observed and what I was distressed about was that there appeared to be no mindset amongst those of us who were there that here were people for whom Christ died, and that we might want to tell them about Jesus somehow, or connect with them enough to be able to talk to them about Jesus next week or next year or sometime. That for me was a breast-beating moment, because I feel myself as partly responsible for that. I'll come back to that one. Now, I want you to come to John 15. We're looking at the Bible now. John touched on this a few weeks ago. I want to remind you about our task, at least an aspect, a crucial central aspect of our task, so that in John 15 verse 26, I think it is, Jesus says, when the Advocate comes, whom I'll send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who goes to the Father, he will testify about me. That's really good. And the next verse, don't forget it. Is it underlined in your Bible? But you also must testify, for you have been with me from the beginning. He's talking about the disciples. But this is a double testimony. Do you see this? The disciples and the Spirit together are doing the testifying. And what he goes on to say in the next little bit, which we heard read, the Spirit will convict people of all this stuff, but presumably they'll convict the people as the people hear the disciples testifying about Jesus. Now, I don't need to go into that. I hope that that's clear enough. But there's a double testifying of the Spirit and the disciples who are doing the thing together. Now go across to Acts chapter 4, because here is the nursing home prayer as it ought to be, and therefore not a nursing home prayer. So Peter and John have been arrested. They've healed a man. There's been a big crowd gather. They tell people about Jesus. They get arrested. They're called up before the Sanhedrin, the same crowd that had Jesus arrested and killed. And so they're told not to talk about Jesus, and so they say, well, we're going to talk about Jesus anyway. That's verse 19 and 20. And then they pray. So this prayer that we heard read, which is verse 23 onwards, the bit that I want you to look at is in verse 29. So this is a prayer for people who have been threatened, intimidated, strongly threatened with death, Now, Lord, consider their threats and enable your servants to speak your word with great boldness. Stretch out your hand to heal and perform signs and wonders through the name of your holy servant Jesus. Now, this is the same double thing that's going on. Do you see? And the difficulty is that the nursing home prayer says, just verse 30, the nursing home prayer says, Lord, you do something. Now, we do want to pray that. We do want to say, Lord, you do something. But what turns a nursing home prayer into a disciples' prayer is to include verse 29. That is, enable your servants to speak your word with great boldness, which is what they were told to do in the first place, and actually both of those things together is what got them into trouble in this occasion. So the Lord stretched out his hand and someone got healed. Then they told the Sanhedrin about Jesus. Both those things together got them into trouble. But that's what they're praying will keep going. So the nursing home prayer is a half prayer, and it needs to be a disciple prayer by saying, Lord, you give me what's needed for me to do what you told me to do, and you do your bit. Both of those things together. That's pretty clear, is it? And now we haven't been threatened with death yet, but we're intimidated. We have all sorts. We can put ourselves in this context, can we not? Now, some assumptions here, which we don't need to go into, I don't think, but I'm just underlining them. There are assumptions that our job is to make disciples. Matthew 28 is to all the disciples that Jesus is speaking to. Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations and teach them to obey. Now, those of you who are teachers need to pay attention to this, and those of you who are not teachers should also. He doesn't say, teach them everything I told you. He says, teach them to obey everything I told you. That's different, isn't it? And one of the things that he told them that they should obey is, go and make disciples. Okay, so I don't need to underline that, do I? That's now a commission handed on to you and me. The same at the end of Luke. This message of forgiveness is to be proclaimed to all the nations. Repentance and forgiveness of sins. That's the end of Luke. And in Acts, another version of it. You are to be witnesses in Judea, in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Witnesses to Jesus. Now, let me talk about breastfeeding prayers. We often read and hear stuff. Some of you have read something in the Messenger by Dr. Carnley, and if you're interested, actually, there's a bit of paper at the back there, written by David Seckham, that gives you another angle on the resurrection debate. We read stuff and we think, this is really terrible, and we say, Lord, what are you doing? Please do something. And that's okay. And sometimes it's in our own church and we think, what is this? But it seems to me that there's a special kind of breastfeeding that we ought to apply to ourselves. So for me, when I saw what was not happening at the talent quest, that was my responsibility because I'm a leader in this church. Now you might hear about it and you might pray, oh, it's no bad that they're not up to scratch, and that's good if you pray for us as well. But we need to beat the right breasts. Sometimes we're beating other people's breasts. I would encourage you to beat your own breasts about yourself, about what you're doing or what you're not doing yourself. Is this your call and passion to tell the gospel of Jesus and to make disciples? Is that what's driving you every day? Do you have an exemption to this? Are you doing things that are more important than this? What is the Lord calling you to do about this? Here's an opportunity for breastfeeding for ourselves. Now, some of us want to see God at work, and I want to make some suggestions about how you might do this. We could copy the 18th century people and actually go and form a missionary society. In fact, I think this would be a really good idea. You could form a missionary society of 2 or 3 people, couldn't you? And you could say, the Lord is calling us to be missionaries too. Now actually we've got a couple represented here. We've got a missionary society here already established. They're called the Gospelers. There's 3 of them here already. The Lord has called them to bring the gospel as the Lord leads them, into Bassendean. They've actually started with. They've been knocking on doors. We've had a vision to see we had an op shop here, and it's closed down. The White Ants got to it and other things, but it was very controversial stopping it because some people were saying, well, if people are coming in here, they've got needs, they talk, and we care for them and stuff. And I thought, that's true. So I thought, well, okay, that's not going to happen now because it's gone. But where are the needs here? Now, we live up near Ashfield, and there's lots of needs up there, lots of state housing, lots of Indigenous housing, lots of, and there's a health bus that comes down to the big oval, the big park at Ashfield, and a diabetes bus, and a street doctor bus, and there must be needs there. So I said to Joy, go and talk to the school, see if there's anything we can do. So the school said, yeah, we want to do a home bird club. So we've got some people who volunteered to do that. There's a breakfast club that people are part of. Here's another little missionary group set up, Missionary Society to Ashfield. Now they're just little examples, and some of you are already involved in all sorts of other things like this. But to get just a couple of other people, it doesn't have to be like the Church Missionary Society's got thousands of missionaries over the years. It could be just a little group of people who say, we want to bring the gospel. We want people to actually hear the gospel, and we want to have a part in actually telling them. We could do that, couldn't you? Well, if you are part of a missionary society or a little mission team, then one of the things that I want to encourage you to do is to tenaciously pray for your mission. Tenaciously pray for it. It's hard work, isn't it? And we can get easily distracted. In the church, there are many other things we can put our minds to, and our prayers to, and our time to. But telling about Jesus, helping people know about Jesus, that is quite difficult and easy to be distracted from it. So pray tenaciously. Well, of course, that assumes that you've got a mission team and you know what God has called you to do. For some of us, we need to go back and beat some breasts and say, well, what happened here, Lord? There was a time when that was the case. In my youth, our youth group was always evangelising. It was in the 60s, we had psychedelic stuff, Remember the violet lights? The violet fluoro lights and all sorts of other... Everything was multicoloured, wasn't it? Rainbow stuff. If you're that old, or you had some other experience once upon a time, is the passion still there? Well, it's grown up, perhaps. But you need another version. Mind you, the psychedelic might be back. Well, see, is there a harvest? So Luke 10, the famous passage in Luke 10. Jesus is talking to the disciples. Let's have a look at this. The beginning of Luke 10. The Lord appointed 72 others, sent them out 2 by 2 ahead of him, to every town and place where he was about to go. He said, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest there to send out workers into his harvest. One of the early translations, one of the very early editions of the Good News said something like, send out more workers, but it doesn't say more workers, it just says send out the workers. So where are the workers if they're not in the harvest? Well, they're sitting under the gum tree, waiting for the wheat to ripen. Yeah, they might be, indeed. Actually, there's a good article in the ABC website today by Justine Toe from the Centre of Public Christianity, reporting on a man who's at Notre Dame, and he's comparing the old monks back in the 4th century, how they got distracted, and how that's like people with their mobile phones getting distracted now, and what the solutions were. He thinks that the problem, they would have said the problem was laziness or sloth, but he says that's really a symptom of the fundamental problem, which is autonomy. That is, I want to do what I want to do. Is there a harvest? Are there any workers out there? Well, now this is a very dangerous prayer that Jesus is suggesting his disciples pray, isn't it? Some of you know this, don't you? Lord, send out labourers into the harvest. Will you pray that? Because you know what's going to happen, don't you? He's going to send you out. And the sooner the better.
And it's going to be lambs among wolves.
Yes, lambs among wolves. But of course, for some of us, we've somehow got in our mind that this is about reaping. Well, John 10 is about reaping. He says the harvest is plentiful. But the harvest in Perth doesn't really look plentiful at the moment. It is plentiful in some ways, and it might be more plentiful than we know because we're not actually doing anything out there. But there's a process here, and for some of us, we need to see that there's a sowing needed. So sometimes we need to pray for sowers to get out there. Pray for the sowers. And I'll tell you what, you know some sowers. Actually, the preachers in this church are sowers. Pray for the sowers, because it's very hard to sow. Actually, there's a bigger process than that, isn't there? There's ploughing and sowing and watering and reaping. And the Lord will call some of us to do bits and different parts of it. But it seems to me that we need to have a mindset. That's I think what I saw when I looked at the what was that thing called? The talent quest. The mindset wasn't there. Now, back in the good old days when I was a teenager, there was a mindset. That was just the thing you did. Everybody knew that, and the youth group having evangelistic stuff all the time. That mindset's not here in this church, and it may not be in the church you're part of. But so those of us who understand this, we need to make a plan for ourselves. Has the Lord called you to share and proclaim the gospel? Maybe at the sowing stage, maybe at the watering, you've got a friend who's heard this, and how are you nurturing it? How are you praying for that person? In churches, we need more missionary societies or mission teams or little groups of people. They don't have to be official necessarily. They could be. We've got a few official ones here. People who say, together we will do this. We will do something. We've got an avenue into this group or these people or this friend or this street. Bridge groups, disciples to do evangelism. So, ploughing, sowing, watering, reaping, and then discipling. That's part of the big picture. Do you have a plan for this? Do you have an intention for this? Do you have a particular field that you can see God is giving you an opening into? Do you have a mindset for it? Are you always looking for gospel opportunities? Paul, this is in Colossians. Just have a look at this. We're nearly at the end. Colossians chapter 4. Amongst the many things he says in Colossians, he says a few things about praying. Colossians 4:2. Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. There's a good prayer for each other, isn't it? And it's the same as before. Pray that I'll do it plainly, boldly. And another version of that, I think, is, and this is a simple kind of outline for one's mind. Pray for opportunities. Pray for the courage to take them. Pray for the words to say. And pray for the Lord to stretch out his hand and be involved in it all. That's kind of an expanded version of Acts 4, isn't it? Pray for opportunities every day. Pray for the courage to have it, to take it. Pray for the words. And you see the words, as the more we do this, the more we'll discover that our words weren't very good this time. Okay, so they're in really good company if that's the case. But that says, okay, I've got to swat up on this, I've got to study this, what will I say next time? But you see, you also got to, this goes back to the nursing home side of it. You're not nursing home patients, we're disciples, but the Lord chooses disciples who aren't fully formed. He chooses disciples who haven't got it all together. He chooses. That's good, isn't it? Yeah. Well, it is good, but it's also a bit difficult because that means we're all involved in it. You know, it's not left to the kind of high-flying, super-duper people. Who are you praying for? Who are the unconverted people on your prayer list? And is it a nursing home prayer that you're praying for your friends? Or are you praying for you to have the opportunity or someone else, so that it's not just God, please save my friend and I don't have to do anything about it. Because that's hard, isn't it? Tenaciously pray for your mission, whatever it is. Now, many of us are onto this, aren't we? Some of us can say, yes, that's right, I agree. Others of us have been sidetracked into really good things. You see, for Christians, the Lord normally sidetracks you, the devil sidetracks you with good stuff. Every now and then people will be sidetracked with bad, sinful stuff, but it's usually good things that occupy our time and attention and preoccupy us in favour of what God really wants us to be doing. Let the Lord show you that if that's the case. So, is the Lord calling you again into this commitment of the gospel? Is he reminding you of something, calling you back to it? For some of us, we're just rejoicing. Yeah, that's what I'm on about. This is really good, I don't know. But for some of us, we need to turn back to the great task. And the breastfeeding needs to be for us, for me. Get back to what God called me to do. For some of us, we've never done it. But for others, we can remember when we did it. Others, we did it last week and there's a lot more to be said about this, but not tonight. I want to encourage you to keep going with proclaiming the gospel, sowing the gospel, watering the gospel, praying that God will give increase to the gospel, give you opportunities to speak the gospel, getting you into a missionary society of some kind if you're not already in one. If you're in one, get in another one. Have 2 or 3. Why not? Plenty of time in your life. Let's stop. Now, it might be tonight that some of us, you can turn that off now, Andrew. Thank you.